German Shepherd cries every time she's touched, until he meets the man who changes everything. Shelter was quiet that morning, quieter than usual, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Outside, rain tapped against the corrugated roof in a soft rhythm, a hushed percussion that did little to disturb the heavy silence within the kennel. The light that filtered through the high, grime-smudged windows was pale and gray, casting everything in the same dim shade of melancholy. The scent of antiseptic lingered, mingling with the faint odor of wet fur and resignation. Max lay curled in the farthest corner of his enclosure, his back pressed into the concrete wall, tail curled tight against his flank. His body, though strong and healthy by all appearances, was a shell hollowed by fear. Ears pinned back, eyes dull and vacant, he didn't move even as the morning feeding cart wheeled past, metal rattling over the linoleum. The other dogs barked and paced in anticipation, noses pressed against chain-link gates. Max remained still. He never barked, never whined, never moved unless forced. The staff had long since stopped trying to coax him. They called him the ghost dog behind closed doors, not out of cruelty, but out of the helplessness that built in the hearts of those who'd tried and failed to reach him. The intake notes told the story. Found abandoned in a wooded lot, emaciated and tethered to a tree with a length of frayed rope, his muzzle raw from clawing at the duct tape that had sealed it shut. No microchip, no collar. Just a scar along his left flank that spoke of deeper harm. Since then, he had barely tolerated human proximity, flinching at even the softest voices, shrinking from any offered hand. The behavioral team gave him 2 weeks before recommending transfer to a behavioral facility 2 hours north, a place known for dealing with dogs deemed unadoptable, unsavable. Chris knew what that meant. He'd seen enough transfers to understand the subtext, but today he was here for him. He crouched outside Max's kennel just after opening hours, a warm thermos of chamomile tea cradled in one hand, and in the other, a sliver of boiled chicken wrapped in a paper towel. No uniform today, just soft jeans and a long sweater, his hair loosely tied back. He had come as Chris the person, not Chris the veterinary nurse. No clipboard, no stethoscope, no charts. Just him kneeling in stillness. He said nothing. He didn't try to reach him. He simply placed the chicken close to the gate, then sat cross-legged with his back resting against the opposite wall of the kennel aisle. He sipped his tea slowly, quietly, as if there were nowhere else he needed to be. And then he waited. Max didn't stir. 20 minutes passed. Rain pattered on. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and was quickly answered. Voices came and went, a low murmur of routine. Chris remained. He watched him only through his peripheral vision. Direct eye contact, he knew, would be too much too soon. Dogs like Max had been taught by pain that human attention led to more pain. The safest thing was stillness. Eventually, Max's eyes flicked toward the food. Not his head, just his eyes. That was enough for Chris to smile softly and say for the first time, "Good boy." His voice was barely a whisper, feather-light and tender. He didn't move again, but he hadn't looked away either. That first visit ended without incident. He hadn't taken the chicken. He hadn't approached. But Chris had left it there, untouched. When he returned the next morning, it was gone. And so began the ritual. Each morning Chris came, always the same, tea in hand, soft voice, patience that never wavered. He brought him bits of chicken, or on special days, small pieces of cheese or broth-drenched rice. He never forced closeness, never pushed. He simply existed in quiet companionship. Sometimes he read aloud in low tones. Jane Eyre, mostly, his voice smoothing over the words like a river smoothing stones. By the end of the first week, Max would lift his head when he arrived. By the second, he was creeping closer to the gate when Chris placed the food. And by the end of the third, he took the treat directly from his fingers, tentatively, trembling, but without flinching. It was the first time Chris had seen light in his eyes. But outside the warmth of these fragile steps forward, time was running out. Chris heard the murmurs during meetings. Behavioral notes marked no substantial progress. Budget concerns. The facility transfer forms were quietly drawn up and left unsigned only because Chris pleaded for one more week. just one. On the 15th day, Max let him touch him. It was fleeting, Chris's fingers brushing against his muzzle as he leaned forward to take the treat. But when he didn't pull back in panic, Chris froze in wonder. Max licked his fingertips, just once, but it was enough to undo him. He left that day with tears in his eyes. That night, lying in his small apartment above the clinic, Chris stared at the ceiling and thought about Max, about the way he curled his body into a crescent to make himself smaller, about the way his eyes still darted to every movement, even when he seemed relaxed. Trust was blooming slowly, like the first brave bud before spring. But it wouldn't survive the cold of the transfer. He couldn't let him go. The decision came quietly but completely. He would foster him. It wasn't easy. The paperwork alone was a bureaucratic wall. The shelter director questioned his objectivity. The board warned him that if Max lashed out or regressed, it would reflect on him. But Chris stood his ground. He presented a plan, a schedule, progress reports, video snippets of Max taking treats, Max looking at him without fear, Max inching closer when called. "I know he's not ready yet," he said during the final review meeting, his voice firm but low. "But he's trying. He wants to heal. If you send him away now, you'll undo everything. He won't make it. You know he won't." In the end, they relented. 1 month of foster, one chance. When Chris came to his kennel that afternoon, Max wagged his tail. It was hesitant, a mere flick, but it was a wag. Chris knelt down, his smile trembling. "Let's go home," he whispered. It took nearly 20 minutes to get him into the car. The leash was terrifying. The open world beyond the gate even more so. But Chris moved slowly, giving him time, letting him sniff every step, never pulling. Max finally climbed into the back seat, curling into a ball as if bracing for punishment. Chris reached back and rested his hand near him, not touching, just there. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. "Not now, not ever." The drive to his apartment was silent. Rain streaked down the windows, echoing the heartbeat of the day. Max didn't lift his head once. Inside, Chris had prepared everything. A thick bed in the corner of the living room, food and water bowls, a soft blanket that smelled of him. He left the front door open behind him and waited. Max stood at the threshold, motionless. Then, one paw, then another. Chris watched as he stepped into the apartment, eyes scanning every corner, body tense and uncertain. He moved like a shadow afraid of its own shape, but he didn't flee. And when Chris settled on the floor across the room, just as he had every morning, Max curled up in his bed and watched him, not with fear, with curiosity, tentative peace. The storm outside grew stronger, thunder grumbling across the skyline. But inside that little apartment, something gentle had begun. Not yet trust, not yet hope, but maybe, just maybe, the first fragile breath of both. Chris learned quickly that healing was not a straight line. The first night with Max in his apartment was quiet, unnervingly so. He didn't sleep, not fully. Every creak of the floor, every shifting shadow outside the window, made his ears twitch and his eyes dart. He stayed in his corner, head on his paws, watching Chris from across the room with the same look he'd seen in Too Many Animals. The look of someone waiting for something to go wrong. Chris didn't try to approach. He kept to his side of the room, speaking only in soft reassurances when he moved, letting him see that nothing bad followed his presence. When he finally drifted into sleep on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket with his phone clutched loosely in his hand, Max remained awake. He didn't whimper. He didn't cry. He just watched. Like he was afraid that if he blinked, this fragile safety would vanish. By morning, he had inched a little closer. Not by much, just a few cautious steps. But Chris noticed. He always noticed. He greeted him gently, crouching low, avoiding direct eye contact. "Good morning, Max," he said with a smile in his voice. "We made it through the night." Max blinked at him. That was all. No tail wag, no soft noise. But he hadn't moved away. That counted. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, one stitched together by patience and soft silence. Chris worked half days at the clinic now, choosing to sacrifice sleep for the hours he needed to help Max. Each morning he prepared his food, boiled chicken and rice at first, then slowly mixing in kibble, always hand-fed. At first, Max would only eat when Chris left the room. Then he started taking food from his palm again, trembling but willing. The sound of Chris's voice became a kind of lullaby, one he used as he moved about the small apartment. Max began to track him with his eyes, sometimes even shifting his head when Chris walked past. He never rushed him. Healing took the time it took. One afternoon, while Chris sat on the floor cross-legged, reading aloud from an old book, Max stood up and stretched, then walked tentatively across the room. Chris's breath caught. He kept reading, not daring to move, heart thudding in his chest. Max approached slowly, like every step was a negotiation between fear and need. Finally, he stopped beside him, standing so close Chris could feel the warmth of his body. He didn't reach out. He just kept reading, and then softly Max lay down, right next to him. Chris felt the sting of tears welling in his eyes, but he blinked them away, knowing even his breathing could startle him. He read until the chapter ended, then set the book aside and whispered, "Thank you, Max." He didn't respond, but he didn't move away either. That night he followed Chris, hesitant, uncertain, as he moved from room to room. When Chris sat on the couch, Max rested a few feet away. When he stood, Max rose with him, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel his presence. A week passed like that. Small milestones accumulated like fallen leaves, unnoticed by most but precious beyond words to Chris. He began taking notes, video clips, photos, progress logs. He needed to show the shelter board evidence of Max's improvement, something tangible to counter the inevitable question, is he safe now? But it was more than that. He wanted to remember, to have a record of every brave step Max took toward trust. His apartment slowly shifted to accommodate him. Rugs were laid across the slippery laminate flooring to ease his anxiety. Mirrors were covered to reduce reflections that made him flinch. The TV remained off. Sudden sounds still startled him. Motorcycles passing outside, thunder in the distance, even the rattle of a dropped spoon. But Chris always responded the same way, with calm. He had never raised his voice, not once. Not even when Max had an accident in the hallway or chewed through the corner of the blanket he'd given him. "It's okay, Max," he'd said every time. "You're still safe." One day, while brushing his teeth, Chris caught Max's reflection in the bathroom mirror. He had wandered just beyond the doorway, his ears perked, watching him. Chris turned, toothbrush still in his mouth, and froze when he saw his expression. It wasn't fear, it was curiosity. The next morning, Max was waiting outside the bathroom door when Chris stepped out, tail giving a single tentative wag. Chris crouched, still in his pajamas, and held out his hand. Max sniffed it. Then he rested his chin in Chris's palm. The moment shattered him. He didn't sob. He knew any sudden movement could ruin the spell. But his throat closed with the weight of it. A dog who once couldn't tolerate touch was now asking for it. That afternoon, he sent a video to the shelter board. Max lying beside him, eyes closed, Chris's hand resting lightly on his back. "I know he still has a long way to go," he wrote, "but please understand, this is progress. This is healing." He didn't expect a reply that day, but one came. It was brief, bureaucratic, and chilling. Due to increased applications for at-risk dogs, Max's foster extension is contingent on reevaluation. Please prepare him for transport pending review. Chris stared at the message for a long time, his hands numb. Transport meant the facility, the place he would not survive. That night, he couldn't sleep. Max lay on his bed across the room, and Chris watched him the way Max had watched him on that first night. Silent, still, afraid to hope. He didn't know how to fight the system. He didn't have clout or connections, but he had something stronger. He had Max. The next morning, he packed a bag. Max's leash, food, his vet records, and the blanket he always returned to after pacing the apartment. Then he called in sick and drove to the shelter office. Max sat in the back seat, shaking lightly, but he didn't whine. Chris parked, took a breath, and looked back at him. "We're going to fix this," he said. "I promise." Inside the office, the board director was surprised to see him. "You can't just show up," he started. But Chris didn't flinch. I need you to see him. Not on paper, not in reports. I need you to see him. With a deep breath, he opened the door. Max stood beside him, leash loose in his hand. His head was low, tail tucked, but he was standing. When the director stepped forward, Max didn't bolt. He didn't growl. He just pressed closer to Chris's leg, seeking safety. Chris knelt beside him and said quietly, "Look at him. This is what hope looks like. This is what recovery can look like. But only if you let it." The room was silent. A long pause. Then the director spoke, softer than before. "We'll schedule a formal evaluation. Until then, he can stay." Chris exhaled for the first time in hours. Later that night, back in his apartment, Max curled beside him on the rug. Chris's hand rested gently on his back, and Max's breathing was calm, steady. "We're okay," he whispered, voice thick with relief. "We're still okay." Outside, the rain had stopped. The world was quiet, and for the first time, Max closed his eyes and fell asleep. Not from exhaustion, but from peace. Max was dreaming. Chris could tell by the way his legs twitched and his ears gave subtle flicks, like phantom sounds whispered in his sleep. His breath came slow, but there was a rhythm to it now. No longer the shallow panting of fear or exhaustion. He lay curled at the foot of the couch, his blanket folded beneath him and one paw tucked under his chin, a position that spoke not just of comfort, but of trust. It had been 2 weeks since Chris received the email granting Max temporary stay pending reevaluation, and he had wasted none of that borrowed time. Each day he built on what they had started in the shelter. They practiced leash time in the hallway of his apartment building, just 10 steps out and back at first. But eventually Max stopped shaking when Chris picked up the leash. They worked on touch, with Chris always letting him initiate it, allowing him the space to decide that his hand meant kindness and not harm. He responded to routine. The morning tea, the reading voice, the soft piano music Chris played in the afternoons. It all grounded him. In small but unmistakable ways, Max was learning to breathe in the presence of peace. But healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks too. Like the night his upstairs neighbor dropped something heavy, and the crash sent Max into a trembling spiral, pacing in frantic circles, tail between his legs, his body language a scream without sound. Chris had crouched beside him, offering no commands, only presence. It took almost an hour before he laid down again, heart still pounding. But Chris hadn't left him. Not once. He was learning that he wouldn't. That morning, Max had rested his head in Chris's lap for the first time. A quiet apology, a silent promise. Then came the moment he hadn't prepared for. It was a Thursday when the shelter's director called, not to ask about Max's progress, but to inform him that someone had come forward claiming to be his original owner. Chris's chest went cold the moment the words reached his ears. He stood frozen in his kitchen, the phone pressed to his ear, his other hand gripping the edge of the counter. "He brought a photo," the director said. "Says Max, his name was Bruno then, belonged to him. The markings match. He's insisting on a reunion." "Was he the one who abandoned Max?" Chris asked, his voice low and tight. "He says Max ran away," came the reply, neutral but laced with doubt. "We're not making any decisions yet. We're contacting you because, well, you've been his primary caregiver. We want to keep things transparent." Chris nodded, though no one could see. His stomach churned. That night, Max was restless again. He seemed to sense something in Chris's energy. The way he moved more slowly, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He hovered near him more than usual, following him with silent steps, pressing his nose into Chris's palm as if to say, "I feel it too." Chris curled onto the floor beside him, resting his forehead against Max's. "I won't let them take you," he whispered, "not without a fight." The next day, he met with the shelter board. Max wasn't with him. He didn't want to stress him with unfamiliar places, but he brought everything else: photos, videos, progress logs, behavioral notes he'd tracked meticulously. He even included a timeline of how long it had taken Max to accept a single touch. He presented his case like a trial lawyer, his voice calm but charged with quiet fire. "Whoever had him before, let him starve," he said, laying down the intake photo. Max in his first days, ribs visible, eyes hollow. Whoever had him before left him somewhere with duct tape on his mouth and rope around his neck. He didn't run away. He was discarded. The man claiming ownership had requested to meet Chris. The board encouraged it. "We need to know all sides," and they said. Chris agreed reluctantly, his heart pounding the morning he arrived. His name was Derek Shaw, late 40s, wiry build, clean clothes. He looked ordinary in the most unsettling way. He shook Chris's hand with a grip too firm, eyes scanning him like a challenge. "Bruno's always been a bit jumpy," he said with a chuckle. "Sensitive dog, but good when he's put in his place." The word place made Chris's stomach twist. He asked him questions, small ones, innocuous on the surface. What food did Max like? Where did he sleep? Did he have any favorite toys? Derek's answers were vague, his anecdotes rehearsed. He showed one photo, a blurry image of a German shepherd in a backyard, but it lacked anything that felt like affection. "He ran off one day," Derek said with a shrug. "Left the gate open by accident. I figured he was gone for good." "And you didn't report it?" Chris asked. "Didn't call the shelters?" Derek's jaw tightened. "Look, I was dealing with stuff, all right?" Chris said nothing. His silence sharpened the air between them. That night he looked at Max differently. Not with doubt, but with a deeper understanding of what he had survived. He thought of all the ways his body had flinched from touch, how he had once tucked himself so tightly into corners, trying to disappear. He imagined him in that man's yard, perhaps hungry, perhaps shouted at, perhaps worse. He didn't cry. He simply lay on the floor beside him again, arms around his sleeping form, and made another promise. "I'm not giving you back to someone who taught you fear." Days passed. The board deliberated. Chris continued to record Max's progress. He now let him brush him gently each morning. He came to him when he called. He had even begun offering soft, hesitant tail wags when Chris returned home. Every moment was ammunition, every act of trust a quiet testimony. Finally, the decision came in a plain white envelope tucked into his mailbox. The letter was short but powerful. Based on the documented behavioral transformation and the nature of the prior environment from which the dog was retrieved, the board has decided to approve full adoption rights to Chris Morgan. Max will remain in your permanent care. Chris stood in his kitchen holding the letter, hands shaking. Max wandered over, sensing something, and pressed his nose against his knee. Chris knelt, laughing through tears, and wrapped his arms around his neck. "You're home," he said, voice cracking. "You're finally, truly home." That night, Max fell asleep not in his corner, but on the couch beside him, his head resting on Chris's lap. His breathing deepened quickly, steady and untroubled. Chris ran his fingers through his fur, eyes closed, heart full. No more waiting, no more fear. Just warmth, just quiet, just love. The mornings had changed. Where once silence lingered like fog in the corners of Chris's small apartment, now there was life in the way Max followed him to the kitchen, tail swinging gently behind him, ears alert, not in fear, but in expectation. He moved with a cup of tea in his hands, and Max padded close behind, brushing past him with just enough confidence to remind him of how far he'd come. The scars he bore, emotional and otherwise, were still there, still stitched into the subtle ways he sometimes froze at sudden noises or flinched at the bang of a dropped spoon, but they no longer defined him. They no longer imprisoned him. He was still cautious, still careful, but he was no longer broken. He was learning to trust the world again, one morning at a time. On Sundays, Chris began bringing him to the nearby park during off hours, early when most people were still sleeping, and the only sounds were wind through trees and the occasional bird startled into flight. At first, he clung close to Chris's side, his leash held loosely in his hands, his body low and uncertain. But gradually, step by step, he began to lift his head more often, sniff the ground with genuine curiosity, even pause beside trees or chase after the drifting scent of something on the breeze. One morning, he startled Chris by pausing mid-walk to look at him, his eyes steady, and then offering a single bark, soft, almost confused, as if testing out his own voice. Chris froze in place, then laughed, hand over his heart. "That's new," he whispered, reaching down to stroke behind his ears. Max leaned into his touch with a confidence that bloomed like spring. It became their ritual. Every Sunday morning, he would make coffee, clip Max's leash on, and they'd set out for the quiet trails. He began to meet other early walkers too, most with dogs, some without. And slowly he introduced Max to them, always watching his body language, always letting him set the pace. It started with brief moments of eye contact, then sniffs, and eventually even a tail wag or two. With a golden retriever named Sadie, Max seemed to find a strange sort of kinship. She was older, gentle, unbothered by his hesitance. She never lunged or barked, simply existed beside him with an almost maternal calm. The first time Max let Sadie sniff his side without backing away, Chris teared up on the spot. "You've got a friend," he whispered, kneeling to kiss the top of his head. It was on one of those walks that Chris met Sam. He was Sadie's owner, a school teacher who wore a perpetually rumpled jacket and had a quiet, warm laugh. They fell into easy conversation over dog behavior, training quirks, and favorite trails. At first, Chris kept his guard up, his focus entirely on Max's comfort. But Sam never pushed. He never filled the silence unnecessarily. Like Chris with Max, he simply showed up, steady and kind. One morning, while Max and Sadie walked side by side down a gravel path, Sam asked gently, "Where did you find him?" Chris hesitated. The story wasn't easy to tell, but he looked down at Max, his ears pricked, tail swaying as he explored a pile of fallen leaves, and he felt the truth rise in him like a tide. "He was in a shelter," he said softly, terrified, completely shut down. "I'm not sure what was done to him before that, but I know it wasn't kindness." Sam nodded slowly. "He trusts you," he said. "You can see it in the way he looks at you." Chris's throat tightened. He didn't, at first. He couldn't even stand to be touched. "But now he does," Sam said with a small smile. "That's all you." He didn't know what to say to that. The words felt like a gift and a burden at once. He hadn't saved Max because he wanted gratitude or praise. He had saved him because he couldn't bear not to. That night back home, he watched Max curl up in his favorite spot near the window, his head resting against the pillow Chris had put there for him. He knelt beside him, resting his head against Max's shoulder, his hand finding the soft spot behind his ear. "I didn't know I needed you too," he whispered, "but I did." As weeks turned into months, life settled into something new. Max had a home, a true one, not a place he merely existed in, but a place he belonged to. He no longer startled at every sound. He greeted Chris when he returned from work with a cautious but joyful wag. He'd begun to sleep belly up, sprawled in the sunshine near the living room window, a sign of ultimate trust. And one rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled through the clouds and Chris braced for the old tremors of panic to return, Max surprised him. He looked up at the sound, ears twitching, then glanced at him, as if checking that he was calm. When he saw that Chris was, he simply lowered his head and sighed. No panic, just rain, just life. Chris knelt beside him, overwhelmed. "You're so brave," he whispered, "so brave." There were still challenges. Certain men with loud voices made him shrink. Sudden flashes of light, like camera phones or headlights, still sent him into quiet withdrawal. But he rebounded more quickly each time. The spiral didn't swallow him whole. He found his way back. They were preparing for his final behavioral review, an official evaluation with the shelter's certified trainer to mark Max's case as closed. Chris didn't need paperwork to know the truth. Max was whole now, but he wanted the record to show it, not for him, not even for Max, but for all the future ghost dogs that might one day be found huddled in corners, forgotten and afraid. The morning of the review, Chris brushed his coat, clipped on his collar, and whispered, "Whatever happens, you've already won." Max looked up at him, tail wagging once, soft and slow. At the facility, Max stepped out of the car on his own, leash loose, shoulders relaxed. The trainer stood outside the gates, clipboard in hand, watching. Chris kept his movements fluid, his voice warm. They demonstrated simple commands. Sit, stay, come. Max responded to each with quiet focus, his eyes always returning to Chris. "He's bonded," the trainer said. "Deeply." "He needed time," Chris replied. "That's all." The trainer smiled. "Not just time, you." The official report labeled Max as rehabilitated through foster to adoption care, with significant reduction in fear-based responses and stable attachment to primary handler. Chris tucked the paper into his glove box. But what mattered most was the look in Max's eyes as they drove home. Calm, trusting, steady. That night, Chris lit a single candle on the table and prepared a special dinner: steamed chicken, soft rice, and a side of pumpkin puree. Max sat nearby, tail wagging, eyes bright. He placed Max's bowl down, then his own, and together they shared a meal. Not just man and dog, not just rescuer and rescued, but companions, survivors, family. As the candle flickered and the quiet warmth of the room settled around them, Chris reached over to gently touch Max's paw. Max looked up, leaned forward, and rested his head against his knee. Chris smiled, eyes wet. "We made it," he said, "together." Outside, the world spun on, loud, uncertain, and often unkind. But inside Chris's apartment, there was peace. There was healing. There was love. And that was everything. The seasons turned quietly, as if reluctant to disturb the peace that had settled over Chris's small apartment. Autumn leaves whispered along the sidewalks, painting the world in muted tones of gold and rust, and the air carried the first hints of winter's edge. Inside, the warmth of a life rebuilt flowed through every corner, soft and steady like a heartbeat, finally finding its rhythm. Max had changed in ways only Chris truly understood. He moved with calm now, not the hesitant shuffle of fear, but the gentle grace of a dog who had learned the world could be kind. His eyes, once guarded and dim, now gleamed with curiosity. He no longer watched the door with dread or shrank from sudden sounds. Instead, he claimed his space with quiet dignity, finding sunlight where it pooled on the floor, resting his head against Chris's leg when he read on the couch, sleeping with all four limbs stretched wide as though he finally believed he belonged. There were still echoes of his old pain, of course. Healing, Chris knew, was not about forgetting. It was about no longer being controlled by the memory. Max would never be the dog who ran into crowds or chased balls across a noisy park. But he was the dog who nuzzled children gently when they passed on the sidewalk. The dog who leaned into Chris's hand without flinching. The dog who, just last week, stood calmly beside him as fireworks burst unexpectedly in the distance. His only response a flick of the ears and a glance at him, as if to say, "Are we okay?" And when Chris smiled and nodded, he sighed, content. They had found their rhythm, a quiet life marked by small joys. Morning walks through the changing trees. Evenings curled up together, a book in Chris's hands and Max's chin on his knee. They'd even started attending training sessions at the local community center, not because Max needed discipline, but because he needed enrichment, new ways to build confidence. Chris had worried he wouldn't adjust to the new environment, but Max surprised him. He watched the other dogs, kept his distance at first, but slowly began to interact, even responding to the trainer's commands with a calm precision that earned nods of respect. "He's one of the gentlest I've ever seen," the trainer said after a session, watching Max settle beside Chris. "There's something in his eyes, like he understands more than he lets on." Chris smiled, stroking the soft fur along his neck. "He does," he whispered. "He really does." Their bond had deepened into something that didn't need words. Chris often found himself speaking to Max aloud, not out of habit, but because it felt natural, like speaking to a friend who always listened. When he laughed, Max wagged his tail. When he cried, Max rested his head in his lap. When he sat in silence, Max sat with him, breathing in time, a steady, anchoring presence. Then came the letter. Chris opened the mailbox one crisp morning and found the envelope sitting there, thin and official. He opened it slowly, reading the words with a furrowed brow, his breath catching in his throat. It was from the Regional Shelter Board, an invitation to speak at their annual conference. The topic, compassion-based rehabilitation, a case study, Max's story. At first, Chris hesitated. He wasn't a public speaker. He wasn't a trainer or a behaviorist or a shelter manager. He was just a veterinary nurse who had refused to give up on a dog everyone else had written off. But that, perhaps, was the point. He sat on the edge of the bed, the letter still in his lap, and looked down at Max, who had wandered over to nuzzle his knee, sensing the shift in his energy. He scratched behind his ears, thoughtful. "They want me to tell your story," he murmured. "Our story?" Max tilted his head and Chris laughed softly. "I guess we should." The weeks that followed were filled with preparation. Chris spent his evenings piecing together video clips, photos, journal entries, documenting the transformation from that first shelter meeting to the Max who now trotted calmly at his side. He wrote his speech carefully, reliving every moment, the early silences, the trembling nights, the first time Max took food from his hand, the first time he leaned into his touch. Each memory brought with it a surge of emotion, but also pride. The day of the conference arrived on a clear November morning. Chris stood backstage, his heart pounding beneath his shirt, clutching a small note card with his speech's opening lines. Max sat beside him, wearing a simple blue bandana and his therapy dog vest, an honorary title, granted recently by the center after his calm, comforting presence had helped another fearful rescue find the courage to step outside for the first time. "You ready, Max?" he whispered. Max blinked up at him, calm and grounded, as if to remind him that they'd already lived the story he was about to tell. All he had to do was share it. When they stepped onto the stage, the crowd of shelter workers, vets, volunteers, and animal advocates fell quiet. Chris cleared his throat, nerves rippling through his chest. But then Max sat down at his feet, pressed gently against his calf, and the panic began to dissolve. He spoke, not from the note card, but from his heart. He told them about the first time he saw him, how Max wouldn't look at anyone, how he flinched at his presence. He spoke of the slow process of earning trust, of creating space where he felt safe, of how he'd learned to move slower, speak softer, wait longer. He described the setbacks, the victories, the fear of losing him to a system that didn't always recognize invisible wounds. He spoke of the morning he found out someone wanted to reclaim him, and how he'd fought to keep him, not just because Max needed him, but because he needed Max too. When he finished, there was silence again, but this time it was full, heavy with emotion. Then applause, slow at first, but growing until it filled the room. Max looked up, ears twitching, and Chris knelt beside him, wrapping his arms around his neck. "Good boy," he whispered. "You did it." Afterward, people approached with tears in their eyes. Some shared stories of animals they had loved and lost. Others asked for advice, for encouragement. One woman whispered, "You gave me hope. For the dog I thought I couldn't save." Chris smiled, his hand resting on Max's back. "Don't give up," he said. "Sometimes all they need is someone who won't leave." They drove home as the sun began to dip low on the horizon, the sky streaked with the warm hues of twilight. Max curled in the back seat, tired but content, and Chris felt a peace settle over him he hadn't known in years. At home, he placed the conference program on the shelf beside Max's adoption papers and the first photo he'd ever taken of him, the one where his eyes were filled with fear and sorrow. Beside it, he placed a new photo from that afternoon. Max sitting tall on the stage, his gaze steady, his body calm, his spirit shining. Chris sat on the couch, Max's head resting in his lap once more, and looked around the apartment. It had never felt like this before. Not before him. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was their home. And as the last light of day faded, he whispered, "We made it, Max. We really made it." Max sighed, eyes closing, tail giving a soft thump. No more cages, no more fear. Just this, warmth, belonging, and the kind of love that heals not just wounds, but the memory of them. A love that asked for nothing but gave everything in return. The journey was over, or perhaps it had only just begun. The past was behind them, the future, theirs to write, together, forever.